We are always taking on new vocabulary themes and language structures in our language classrooms. How do you make sure that your students are engaging with these new topics, particularly when it comes to speaking? In this episode, I speak with Jessica Hall, aka Miss Señorita, who is a Spanish teacher in Connecticut. Jessica shares 3 speaking activities that are easily modified for various levels and languages. You can use them right away with any vocabulary topic or language structure. And Jessica even provides the templates. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for being here. And I know you're sick of it, but I'm going to say it anyway. You are an incredible educator because, look, you're probably most likely not in your classroom right now, and you're listening to a podcast about language teaching. So thank you so much for doing that. That is wonderful. So thank you so much for being here. On today's episode, we are going to be looking at speaking activities. And I know I hear from listeners all the time. They love episodes when they can hear about activities that they can take and do in their classroom concretely with their students. So you are going to get lots of those today from Jessica Hall. And you might know Jessica as Miss Señorita. That is her handle out there in the internet world. And she's a Spanish teacher in Connecticut, and she has spent her time with middle and high school students for the majority of her career. And I want to bring you right into this conversation, Miss Señorita Jessica Hall, so that we can learn so much from you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So exciting, right? As I was saying at the beginning, teachers love activities that they can use right away in their classroom. They enjoy the theory and understanding the why, but when they see a title of an episode that is very clearly, oh, I can try this with my students, this is a new idea, that's when people click. Let's start our conversation by just hearing from you, from your perspective, like what are the benefits of making sure that we are incorporating speaking activities into our world language classrooms?
I think that the whole point of learning a language is to be able to speak it. And it's really great if you can read really well or write really well or listen really well, but nobody, when you ever speak to them, is going to say, oh, wow, you read so well. They're going to comment on how well you speak. That you speak Spanish so well. So that's what people are going to notice. And that's really the most useful of those 4 skills.
That's a good lens on it. I think that so many times when people are learning a language, we do focus on the other modes and all of that. But so much of it is if you're going somewhere, you're going to engage verbally with the language that way. Absolutely. So you have some great ideas to share with us that we can be using in our classroom.
So I would love to share 3 speaking activities that I have used and that I use all the time. I find them to be really helpful among like Spanish 1, Spanish 2, Spanish 3 for just about any vocab or grammar. I've never taught another language, French or German or anything, but I'm sure that they could easily be adapted to another language. I would love to talk about a partner activity and then 2 whole class activities.
Something that is often challenging for teachers is they'll get an activity and it's not easily adapted to different levels. It's like, oh, this only works with level 1 or this only works with level 3. So I really appreciate that you're bringing activities to us that can be easily adapted to different levels. And I'm sure they are based on communication, so they would go for any of the languages, as you said as well. But that's something to really keep in mind, because sometimes when we start talking about activities, they're very much novice level. They're always like that level 1. So teachers are always looking for, that's great that it works there with colors, but what about, these other topics? So thank you very much for that foresight of thinking that these are activities that are adaptable. So that's great. So speaking of these great activities, why don't we dive in with the first one that you have to share?
Yes. So let's talk about a partner speaking activity. Every student needs to already know who their partner is. Have them seated in twos or some sort of scenario where it's already determined who that is. So one student gets a student A paper and the other student gets a student B paper. They have prompts for a question and then prompts for their partner's answers. So when a student first looks at this paper, they're going to see that the question prompts and the answer prompts don't match each other because they're going to be talking to their partner. This is something for a lower level activity you could do, let's say, with food. I find that to be just a really easy example. And then whatever question you've been teaching, ¿qué quieres para la cena? ¿Qué prefieres? Like whatever verb you're kind of like going with for food here, you would give them a subject pronoun prompt for whatever that question is. And then their partner would look at their answer prompt, which would have the food activity or the food vocab that you're teaching. And they would respond using that vocabulary. And so they would kind of go back and forth asking and answering questions.
When you say that, say partner A had the question and partner B has the vocabulary you're working on, so they are choosing amongst that vocabulary, so they're personalizing their answer?
So there's a lot of ways you could do it. You could just give them a bunch of different vocab to choose from. You could say the answer to question number 1 is bananas. The answer to question number 2 is apples. So you can give it a lot of structure, but they're going back and forth, taking turns, asking and answering questions. So they both have question and answer prompts on their paper that match with the other person's things.
So they go back and forth.
Yes.
So it's not just A has all the questions and B has all the answers.
So they're both practicing vocab, whatever that vocab is that you're teaching.
How long would that activity go back and forth with them typically?
I really like to limit the length of activities because I have a short attention span and so does everyone else. So I would recommend like 3 to 5 minutes.
And then switch up partners or move on to something else? Have you done that where, okay, you've done this with one partner and now you're going to do it with another partner?
You certainly could.
I'm always just looking for little ways to extend. It's like, oh, and what comes after that? Can they try it with somebody else? Because you had mentioned that you can do it in a way where they have the possibility of answers, but there's no necessarily right or wrong answer. Like if you're asking, what time do you have dinner? And you have 7 times that are possible. So with one partner, they'll use one answer. Then if they had it with another partner, they could change up their answers. Just always thinking of ways to, what more could we do with this? And I do know you. I've known you for a while, Jessica, and I know that you love a good template.
I do, yes.
Yes. Whenever I talk to you about what you're doing in your classroom, you're like, if I figure something out, I come up with a template and I'm going to use that template. Yes. So I'm hoping that you actually have a template for these activities that our listeners could maybe get a hold of.
Yes, absolutely. I do. So I made editable templates for 3 speaking activities, plus a handout that I use for grading, either grading or quote unquote grading participation during speaking activities. So all of those 3 are bundled together. You can download them for free.
So we will make sure the link in the show notes goes directly where they can get that from you on your website. So we have our partner A and B activities. You gave a couple of themes that you were working with there. You had mentioned food. And that, again, we're kind of looking at that novice level. Yeah. If we had a level 2, level 3 class where they were doing that A-B partner activity, what are some themes that you would envision for a higher proficiency level?
So for Spanish 2, you could easily do like a preterite, ¿Qué hiciste ayer? And they have a bunch of different activities. ¿Qué hizo Juan? Or imperfect with adjectives. For a level 3, you could do it with the subjunctive. So make them give recommendations. Yo recomiendo que tú. and then give them options for what they would recommend. That could possibly be, instead of a question and answer scenario, it could be like I give you a situation, you give me advice instead. So like a kind of twist on the A-B partner speaking.
I like the idea of having the options for the answers because I think so many times in our language classes, we have these multiple things going on, and it's almost like a bit of cognitive overload for our students, where it's not only do you need to be creating in the language, but you also have to be a creative writer and a creative speaker and come up with all these answers and create all these scenarios and also make sure you're using the right verb form and make sure, and so this idea of taking a little bit of that cognitive load of having to create the answers that, oh, okay, I can just choose from here. And then you're actually just focusing on the speaking activity more. So I'm always looking for ways to take the cognitive load off of students a bit. And that's definitely doing that. That was a partner activity. So let's go on to our second possibility.
Okay, so I do have a cutesy nickname for this. So this is a whole class speaking activity. I call this Ask and Switch. And I think that it's one of those things that once you explain the directions, then the next time you're just like, it's ask and switch. And kids are like, oh, okay. It's very easy. In this activity, every kid gets an index card with a question or a prompt for a question on one side and a prompt for an answer on the other. So that part is very similar to the partner activity. They get up, they walk around the room, they walk up to someone, they ask the question and show their partner the index card with the answer prompt. So their partner answers based on that answer prompt. Or you can leave it open-ended if that's simpler, depending on like how challenging you want to make this activity. Then the partner asks their question. You answer the partner's question based on that answer prompt. You switch cards and you go talk to somebody else. So you're getting a lot of practice with a bunch of different questions and a bunch of different answer vocabulary.
On one side, you have a question. On the back of that same card is the response to that question?
Yes, you're showing that answer to your partner.
So they're reading the question out loud and then they're reading the response? I just want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly.
I always give like a prompt. So let's just talk about food. It's so easy. If we're teaching ¿Qué quieres para la cena? All forms of querer with food vocabulary, for the question prompt, I would just have a subject pronoun. So it would just say tú, and they would know ¿Qué quieres? ¿Qué quieres tú? Mm-hmm. And then for the answer prompt, it would just be a picture. So it'd be like a picture of chicken. And then they would say, oh, yo quiero el pollo.
I like that. So you have a scaffold on there to help them, but it's not a full question written in words and a full answer written in words where they're just reading it. They have the question and the picture as their scaffolded.
It is like super, super new. Like if they just learned ¿Qué quieres? All forms of querer that day, then I would have all of the questions written out somewhere visible in the classroom that they could refer to if they needed to or if they wanted to. But I wouldn't put it directly on there because I don't want it to be a reading activity. Like I want you to come up with the question yourself, even though it is prompted. Mm-hmm. But then if it's vocabulary that they've used 100 times, then I wouldn't have those things to refer to because they wouldn't need it.
This is also supporting what I was saying with the other activity with taking some of that cognitive load off. Where they, like even on the back, if you had, 4 possible pictures, like I'm just using whatever you had on the AB activity, and then you just choose one of those. Yeah. So you don't have to be creating. And so it's like, okay, I have to come up with an answer and then figure out how to put it in a sentence and like all the things at once going through that way. And do you have a template for that?
Yes. So that is included.
So that's part of the whole template bundle? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Let's go on to number 3.
Yes. So the last speaking activity is also a whole class activity. I really like an activity where kids get up out of their seats because they don't really get to do that a lot. I mean, unless they're going between classes, that's probably it. And that makes just about anything more interesting. Again, they get up out of their seats. They have a paper that is either a 4x3 grid with answer prompts in it or a 3x3 or however many answer options you want to give. And usually I assign them an answer, but you could also do it with unassigned. And so they get up and they walk around. And usually I do it where there is one predetermined question. So, ¿Cómo eras de niño? Or de niña, whoever they're talking to. And then there's however many different predetermined options for answers. And so they go up and they ask somebody and they respond. And then you write the name of the person in that box. And then you have to find all 9 or 12 of the answer options. And then you go back to your seat. I usually structure it so there's just one question they're saying over and over again with a bunch of different answer options.
And so if we take that out of the novice level and bring that up to level 2 or level 3, what are some possibilities of using it at that level?
This becomes a little bit harder because you're working with a small little box. So it's harder to prompt a longer response. But any vocabulary you're teaching at an upper level, preterite tense, where did you go last weekend? They could do something like that. Or health vocabulary. I know I teach a health unit, how to stay fit and healthy in Spanish 3. So again, they would be giving recommendations.
Throughout all the activities that you do with your students, and it might be one of these 3, are there particular ones or one that students gravitate towards that when you say we're going to do this, it gets the best response?
I would say that's probably ask and switch because it means they get to get up out of their seats. And they like that, and they get to talk to people around the class that are not the person that they sit next to. I really like ask and switch. And again, once you explain the directions one time, you're gold. Everybody knows what to do.
I love seeing when we do these types of activities in the classroom that sometimes I will walk by a science class and I'll see them doing something that was similar to what we were doing. And I'll ask the science teacher later and they'll be like, oh, yeah, they told me that they were doing this in the language class. I'm just going to do the switch activity with science. When you're doing these activities with your students, what has been sort of the effect it has on them? Have you seen that by regularly doing these and having students engage, that it is helping their confidence and wanting to use the language? What's been the kind of ultimate benefit of doing these types of activities with your students?
Yeah, so I start speaking activities on day 1 when everybody's on their best behavior and they want to impress you. And I try to keep it super low key and super low pressure because as soon as people feel judged, then it's like, ooh, and then like nobody wants to do the speaking activity and they would rather sit in silence, which is not at all what I want and does not benefit them long term. So doing them regularly just from the beginning of the year, and then also like it's fun and it's super low key, and just turn to your partner and we're just going to practice this vocab with our classmates, like so that nobody feels like, it's too scary to speak Spanish.
Coming back to that cognitive load again. So, and I have to create. I didn't go to the movies this weekend, though. So what am I going to say? And so with a lot of these, I'm not seeing them as sort of games with a winner.
Oh,
right?
no.
Like a lot of times we do these activities and it's like games with the winner. How do you determine who wins? What's the prize and everything? So it's taking that element out of it. And it's really about that. So do you ever have follow-up activities after they've done this where they're engaging with that vocabulary in another way? So you can take any one of these 3 activities we just talked about, and they've done this, and then what's sort of a next step that you might do?
So you can pretty easily make them into a writing activity. So the 3rd whole class speaking activity I talked about, where they're finding somebody who did each of these things or used to be one of these things or identifies with any of the answers, they're writing their name in that box. So then it could become a writing activity where you're taking the information you got, and then John era tímido. So writing activity is always my favorite go-to after a speaking.
When teachers are particularly new to the teaching profession and they haven't done some of the whole class speaking or even some of the partner activities and things like that, there's some hesitation because of the management aspect to it, because you have to be comfortable with some organized chaos when your whole class is speaking, right? So could you give us some tips or some helpful suggestions, perhaps? And again, these could be for seasoned teachers or for teachers that are newer and thinking, how do I get into this? How do you keep that a manageable situation when you have all the students speaking at once, which is what we want.
Yes.
but we have to keep it managed, right? So talk to us about that.
Yeah. So in terms of a whole class activity where all of the students are walking around the room, I give a long lecture before we do this the first time and then the second time, and then probably like up through the 10th time about my expectations for behavior, that there is no running, there is no yelling, you don't need to touch each other. Like we go through all of those things. And if somebody decides to then just bolt around the room because they have lost their mind because they're in 7th grade or whatever, I make them sit down. They feel very silly because they have to sit there for all of 2 minutes while everybody else gets to walk around the room and speak. And so that's what I have done. But like, you need to sit down. I usually only have to do that once or twice before it's like, okay, yes, this is a walking activity, not a run activity. And then in terms of making sure everyone is on task and speaking Spanish and not speaking in English or sitting there in silence, which is sometimes the choice that they make, I have a participation handout that I give to students. So it's basically a grid of 5 boxes across for 5 days of the week. And then I usually do like 5 or 6 boxes down. So it'll last a good like month and a half. And then as they're engaging in the activity, I walk around with 2 highlighters. Every student has this handout on their desk. So they either get a green mark in the box, which means that they're on task. They're doing the activity, at least for the 5 seconds I was walking past, and it's worth 2 points. Or they get a pink mark. And all I have to do is take out the pink highlighter and wave it around, and everybody is suddenly speaking Spanish. They're probably yelling at their partner in Spanish, but hey, we're back on task. And then the pink mark would be a -1.
Is that template part of the templates that you were talking about?
Yes, that is included.
Yes,
and then I collect that paper at the end of the month, or you could do it for the whole marking period. And, basically everybody gets 10 points for free for participation or something like that. So whatever will make the grading easy for you.
I always think when I'm doing an activity such as that I've thought about everything that could possibly happen, and you do your pre-discussion, and then there's always something. So that's always, particularly for new teachers, there's going to be something you didn't think was going to happen that happens. So you got to stay flexible. So I always just tell students, I reserve the right to add additional rules as needed. Sometimes you just need to do that. Like I've done a similar activity. I call it quiz trade, the ask and switch that you were talking about. And what they'll do a lot of times, which I didn't anticipate, is they just constantly go to their friends and stay in a friend group, and they're not moving with everyone else. So I instituted a rule that you can't go to the same person twice in a row. You can't go back to the same person until you've gone to 3 other people. And they would say, but you didn't tell us that rule. And I'm like, but remember, I reserve the right to add new rules as necessary. Just keep that in mind, all of you that are figuring out. But that was the best thing. I reserve the right. So do you have some recommendations for us about where you're continuing to learn or where you're being inspired from with your teaching?
Yeah. So I somewhat recently, maybe within the past year, learned about the World Language Teacher Summit. So it's basically, while it's going on, it's free, which is the right price. But if you Google it, World Language Teacher Summit, and you're like, there's a price with this, that's because it's not currently going on when you Google it. So you would have to pay for the replay. But while it's going on, it's free. You can watch the sessions from the comfort of your couch or your bed in your pajamas. It's maybe like 4 or 5 sessions a day on different topics, and you can see in advance what they all are. So I think that there's always something where I'm like, ooh, that actually looks really interesting. And there's probably several throughout the week that look really interesting, and you have 48 hours to watch them for free. So I definitely really recommend that because it's actual PD for world language teachers and is actually helpful.
And it happens a couple of times a year. It's not just once, right?
I think it happens 3 or 4 times a year.
If you Google it, you can kind of get on the list for when the next one's coming up so that you can get in there. Miss Señorita, Jessica Hall, how can we be connecting with you beyond these activities?
I do have a Facebook. If you search Miss Señorita on Facebook, you'll find me. I also have an Instagram. I don't post a lot on social media, but I do exist in the social media world.
Your Instagram's pretty good, so don't discount it.
Yep.
You do good Instagram stuff for sure. So as we are finishing up this conversation, I like to leave our listeners with a hearty piece of advice. What do you have?
Yeah, so something that I don't feel like teachers in the classroom hear enough is that you are doing great. Students are learning a language and they're learning how to speak a language. You're doing great. Kids are learning in your class.
Thanks for that reminder, which is so important. Like I say at the beginning of every episode, you're listening to a podcast about language teaching. Who does that? You do that because you're awesome. So thank you so much. And thank you to you, Jessica Hall, Miss Señorita, for spending this time with us and bringing these activities to us and for offering the templates where we can do them immediately in our classroom. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Jessica Hall? Don't forget to download the free templates so you can start using these activities right away. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Jessica Hall. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. And there's also links to get in touch with me if you would like to work together. And we can do that in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.